sure that many of you saw me come up here with this box. I want to tell you a little bit about life. Life is like a 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle without the box. Now, puzzles aren't very difficult to put together as long as you have the box. Now, I know that some pieces are easy to put together because they have edges on them. You know, that the edge pieces sort of make sense to us because we can understand where they go. Well, life is like that sometimes. Sometimes some things happen to us in life, and we don't need to talk to God about it per se because it kind of makes sense to us the reason that it happened. But most of life is not like that. Most of life is like this craggly, jagged, obscure piece. We're not exactly sure where it fits without the box. You might guess, you might assume, but we might not be sure where this piece fits if we do not have the box. In my life and in your life, I think we would all agree that there's a great benefit in seeing the whole picture. But since we can't, we need to learn to trust the one who can. Because there's only one. You know, he's the puzzle maker. He's the designer, the creator. He's the one because he is sovereign, because he's omniscient, because he's always present. He has the benefit of the box. And God, in his omniscience, knows how and where and when in each one of our lives that this jagged puzzle piece is supposed to fit. He has the benefit of the box. There's some people in Scripture who had a jagged puzzle piece, something they could not understand. But they went to the one who could. So join me in John chapter 11. I want to share a story this morning that's very familiar to most of us, the story of Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus. Mary and Martha sat down at a table one day, and they tried to put the puzzle together. And the piece they couldn't understand was the death of their brother, Lazarus. And they needed an expert to come along to help them understand why this event occurred. Maybe this morning, some of you are puzzled about the way your life is going. Maybe some of you have one of those jagged interior pieces right now in your heart and in your mind. And it just doesn't make sense. Maybe you pray to God fervently about something and he didn't answer your prayers. And you say, why, oh God? Why did this happen? And right now, heaven is silent. Or you might say, Lord, if you would have been here, then this wouldn't have happened. And you know what? You're probably right. Maybe some of you are isolated. Maybe you're lonely. Maybe you feel out of touch or distant. Maybe you're plagued by all the violence and senseless tragedies that have occurred around our world. Maybe some of you have been diagnosed with a chronic illness. You've been dealt a bad bill of health. Maybe you recently lost a parent or sibling or spouse to cancer or death. Maybe your spouse was unfaithful and you've recently been divorced. Perhaps you were a mama-to-be, but the baby never made it. And some nights you just find yourself crying. And so here you are weeping, and you find yourself saying, Lord, I just don't understand. Some time ago, 2016 to be exact, I suffered a great tragedy. Tremendous weeping, loss of appetite, sleepless night, just unbearable pain and agony. I'll never forget the day I received the worst news of my life, that my father was going to die. And he was placed in hospice, and I stood there with just this dumbfounded, baffled look on my face. And I did not understand. And I remember thinking to myself that there has to be another way. There must be an alternative. Okay, everyone, you know, it's 2016. Let's pull out the best technology we have now. Let's get him well again. God, come off your throne and come rescue us. Right? God, come save my dad. Give us the same power that you use to save Jairus' daughter or the centurion's servant, Lord. Give us your might. But he didn't. and I just did not understand. And I had one of those jagged puzzle pieces in my life and questions in my life at that time, just like Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So this morning, I want to share with you some things in John chapter 11 that I learned at that time in my life that I hope it will help you if you are struggling like I have struggled. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one whom you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, please underline this in your minds, he stayed where he was 2 more days. I've got to tell you a little bit about Bethany this morning before we get started. Bethany was a small town off the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. It was located about 2 miles from Jerusalem, about. It was here where Jesus often resorted for a little R&R. It was his kind of resort where he was able to get away briefly from the suffocating crowds that constantly pressed on him. It was here at Bethany that kind of became his home away from home, his oasis, his refueling station. He loved this place, and he loved these people. Jesus was asked to do a lot for many people during his day. Everywhere Jesus went, strangers wanted bread from him. But it was here with this family that Mary and Martha served him bread. Everywhere else Jesus went, people wanted to be healed by his touch or just to touch the hem of his garment. But it was here with this family that Mary and Martha healed his spirit with their kindness and hospitality. Everywhere else Jesus went, his feet got dirty, and he washed all of his disciples' feet. But it was here with this family that Mary washed his feet with her hair. On 3 separate occasions, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 36, it says Jesus loved this family. And verse 11 calls Lazarus his friend. So you would think that if there was any village on the planet that would get an exemption from suffering, it would be this embassy, this resort hotel for Jesus, the one place that he could get away from the paparazzi and escape. You would think that Christ would say, boom, Bethany exempt. They get a get out of jail free card. They're free from suffering. But not only Bethany in general, but Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in particular. Martha was the one who slaved over a hot stove and cold dishwater for him. Mary was the one who sat spellbound at his feet as she listened intently to every word of his teachings. Lazarus was the one that Jesus ate, leg of lamb with together, and they played spades together at the living room table. You would think that there was any town that should have been exempt from suffering, it would have been Bethany. And if there was any family that should have been exempt, it would have been Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. On 3 separate occasions, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 36, it says Jesus loved this family. And verse 11 calls Lazarus his friend. Now, I know that Jesus loved everyone. I know that. I know that Jesus loved everyone so much that he gave his life on the cross. Now, we talk about it all the time. Perhaps the most famous verse in all of the Bible, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I know that. But I am not aware of another place in Scripture where Jesus' love for someone is so clearly and clearly expressed, explicitly expressed in this way. 3 times in one chapter. So here's our first lesson we want to learn this morning. Tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. Tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. We must understand that on the fallen planet, that tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. On a planet that is infested with sin, on a planet that has tilted off course, our world is messed up. And in a messed up world, all of us at one point or another are all going to suffer tragedy. Tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. I'd like to demonstrate this truth to you this morning by going back and looking at some events that occurred throughout the history of the Bible. So reimagine these biblical scenes with me, if you would. Notice Abel's chalk outline as his blood cries out from the ground after his envious brother murdered him. Abel was a good man. Notice Joseph rotting away in jail for something he did not do. For 13 years, he was wrongfully displaced in jail for something that he did not do. Joseph lost 13 years of his childhood as a slave. Maybe he was a bit of a tattletale and a spoiled brat, but for the most part, he appears to be a righteous and outstanding young man. He was faithful to his father, he was faithful to Potiphar, and he was honorable to Mrs. Potiphar. He did nothing wrong. He spent 13 years of his life in jail. Joseph was a good man. Moses was up to his neck in manna breath murmurers, never to enter the promised land. Moses was a good man. Hannah, the barren womb mother, Hannah, her eyes pierced through the screen of her cell phone as she vainly scrolls through Amazon, wishing she had a baby that she can buy some toys for. You know, Hannah was a good woman. Job, unwittingly caught up in the middle of the pitchfork halo wars, lost all that he had. Job was a good man. In the Old Testament, God's Old Testament friends and Jesus' New Testament friends, when you look at the events that occurred in history, people who knew God and people whom God knew still suffered tragedy. Tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. I believe the very first thing we need to do today, before we talk about grief, is agree on this one point. Because if we don't, then we'll be disillusioned. And if we're disillusioned, then there's no answer for grief. If you're disillusioned, then there's no answer. If we're going to learn to cope with the jagged puzzle piece in our lives that we call tragedy, grief, and suffering, then we better have realistic expectations about life. They better be realistic. People will die. People will get sick. I don't want it to be that way. God did not want it to be that way, but it will occur. And as Christians, our faith will not be shaken if we start with this first premise, that tragedy is inevitable on a planet that is wobbled off course. We've got to start there. And if we start there, then our ears will be open to the rest of the answers that we're going to hear today. It will help us go through these difficult times. If there was ever a town in which Jesus should have given an exemption, if there was ever a family that should have been inoculated from sin and suffering, it should have been Bethany, and it should have been Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But wait a minute, Deonte, that's not the whole story. You painted part of it, but Jesus could have stopped his busy itinerary. You know, he didn't have to give him an exemption, you know, but he could have paused his ministry, heard the news, hopped on the fastest camel, got down to Bethany, and laid his hands on his friend Lazarus, whom he loved, and healed him before he died. And you know what? You're right. Jesus could have done that, but he didn't. You say, well, he didn't even know Jairus, and Jairus came up to him and said, hey, Jesus, my daughter is sick. I need you to come heal her. And he went to go heal his daughter. You know, and on the way to heal Jairus' daughter, you know, the hitchhiker, the woman with the issue of blood comes along, and, you know, she's anonymous in the story. She doesn't even have a name, and he healed her. I mean, if he's going to heal people that doesn't even know, then shouldn't he heal someone that he says he loves? Doesn't that make sense to you? Isn't that why we have a problem with suffering? Because that's not right. That's not right. That no good, low life, murdering pedophile drunk, he's being blessed. He's being blessed. And the man up here in the amen corner who has made Christ the heartbeat of all that he is, at 31 years of age, has 2 brand new twins. Doctor says he has terminal cancer to live less than 6 months. That's not right. God ought to hop on a camel, get down here and fix that, right? But we learned in the Bethany story that Jesus does not do that. And we're going to see why here in a moment. Okay, Deonte, I give you this. He didn't like give him an exemption. You know, he didn't like hurry up, get on the fastest camel and fix the problem. But Deonte, there's more to the story. He could have at least sent the cure via Wi-Fi, right? You know, remember the centurion servant? He said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my house or under my roof. He said, Lord, just say the word. And Jesus just said the word and he healed them. He could have just said the word and healed Lazarus, his friend, whom he loved from where he was. But he didn't even do that. So we've already learned our first lesson this morning, that tragedy is inevitable even for the friends of Jesus. We've got to learn the second lesson this morning. Delay is probable even for the friends of Jesus. Delay is probable even for the friends of Jesus. Can I go back in history for a moment? Just recap these events with me in your mind. I want to give you a few biblical scenes. Can't you see Noah going outside every day after the promise? Day 1, no rain. 5 years later, no rain. Or 10 years later, still no rain. Let me illustrate it for you this way. If Noah was given the command about the flood, let's say he was given the command in 1903, okay, 120 years ago, in 1903. I want you to think about what Noah would have experienced before God fulfilled his promise. Think about this with me, if you will. Noah would have lived through 1903. So the first flight was conducted by the Wright brothers. 1914, the start of World War I. 1928, women were legally allowed to vote. 1929 through 30, he would have lived through the Great Depression. 1941 through 46, World War II. 1952, Queen Elizabeth becomes queen. How about the 60s? Vietnam, civil rights movements, the first Super Bowl. How about the 1970s? Nixon, Watergate. He would have lived through the Gulf War. He would have lived through Desert Storm, the invention of computers, putting a man on the moon, over 30 Olympics, smartphones, the invention of electric cars. How many presidents? Think how long that is. And God made him wait. God said, I'm going to destroy the earth by a flood, and I want you to build a big, giant ark, and I want it to be a floating zoo. That's delay, man. Now, I'm sure he had his reasons, but that's delay. Let me give you another. How about Abraham and Sarah? Abraham wrote an announcement about the birth of his son Isaac on Facebook, but he had to wait 14 years before he could post it. You know, and really 25 if you count when the promise was first made. You know, he's like, we're going to have a boy. We're going to have a baby. He logs onto Facebook, and he has to wait 14 years before he can post it. That's delay. So think about this with me. Sometimes we don't really flesh these stories out. You know, we just kind of read them over and skim them over. But imagine this with me. Let's fast forward 1 year from today. Imagine if God comes to me and says, Deonte, you and Jessa, you're going to have a baby. And I say, okay, Lord, I believe you. So I'm 32 years old now. I'll be 33 next year. Then. Imagine this. God gives me the promise when I'm 32, but I don't have a baby until I'm 55 years old. 25 years later. That's delay. And Abraham, he's the father of the faithful. He's the main dude in the Old Testament. He's the one who gives birth to Israel. He's the one that's going to give birth to the Messiah. And God made him wait. Delay is probable even for the friends of Jesus or the friends of God. We must understand that God is not always going to work on our timetable. He's not going to work according to our schedule, even though I believe that man is the most important creature in God's address book. I really do believe that. I believe that Deonte Watkins is probably somewhere way up high on God's to-do list every single day. I really do believe that. I believe I'm that important to him. But I have to remember that God's calendars, God's wall clocks, his watches are calibrated to a different standard than mine. His timing is not my timing. So what have we learned? Tragedy is inevitable, even for the friends of Jesus. Delay is probable, even for the friends of Jesus. Is what we learn in this story. Now, why would God delay? I think that's a fair question here because I want to know. I want to know, why does God delay in this Lazarus story? Why does Jesus hear the news about Lazarus, his friend whom he loved, that he was going to die, and then wait 2 more days? We've already established that Jesus loved these people and he loved this family. So if Jesus has the ability to heal someone, why does he wait 2 more days before he goes to Bethany and heals Lazarus? Let me offer you a few suggestions on why Jesus might have done this. First of all, in verse 4, it says this. It says, so that God would be glorified. In verse 4. All of you fellow weepers out there who are pilgrims crying on our way to heaven as we struggle together. This is hard for me to say, but I don't know how else to say it. God is more important than we are. And because he is more important than we are, that may necessitate that we go through periods of grieving, even though we don't understand it. We may not know where this jagged puzzle piece fits, but God does. And we may grieve because we don't know where it fits. It may cause us great anxiety, but God knows where it fits. And God's glory is greater than any of our wants. I think sometimes in the church we've forgotten that. And I think in America we've certainly forgotten that. Because in America, everything becomes about the person in the pew and not the God that we read about from the pew. We are a consumer-oriented society. We want the most bang for our buck. But it's really about God's glory. And Jesus says, Mary, you don't get it. Martha, you don't get it. Lazarus, you don't get it. But it's going to be for my Father's glory. It's going to be for some greater purpose. Sometimes grief is like that. It's for some greater purpose. Not only was it for God's glory, but it was also so that Israel would be without excuse. So that Israel would be without excuse. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I believe that there is a connection between the parable of the rich man Lazarus from Luke chapter 16 and this story of Lazarus here in John chapter 11. It's been said, why does he give him a name in that parable in Luke 16? You know, it's the only parable with a name. Lazarus is Aramaic for God is my helper. But remember what he says at the end of that parable, you know, when the rich man wants to go back up and tell his brothers about this place called Hades. Remember what he says at the end of it? He said, the Jews will not believe even though one rises from the dead. Now in John 11, guess what happens? Jesus' last miracle in the book of John, he raises a man by the name of Lazarus from the dead. And guess what they try to do in chapter 12? In chapter 12, look at what happened, what they try to do in chapter 12, verse 9. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. So they wanted to kill him again. He was just raised from the dead. They wanted to kill him again. So Jesus raises him from the dead, and they want to kill him again. So why might Jesus allow Lazarus to die? So that God would be glorified and that Israel would be without excuse. That someone would be raised from the dead and they would still show their obstinance and rebellion. That they would still refuse to believe even though someone has been raised from the dead. You see, God has purposes. His purposes are bigger than ours. We may not always understand them, but that's one of them here. Let me give you another reason. So the disciples' faith might be strengthened. He waits so that their faith might be strengthened. I tell you what, if you're going to follow someone as a disciple, if you're going to die for them, if you're going to die for the cause as a martyr, I think you better be sure of one thing, the resurrection. And you better be sure that Jesus is who he says he is, right? If you're going to die, you better be sure that Jesus is who he says he is. So why does Jesus hear the news about Lazarus, his friend whom he loved, wait 2 more days and allow Lazarus to die? And then he said to his disciples, don't worry, he's only sleeping. Because when he comes to Bethany, he knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead to demonstrate his power over sin and death. So they will see they don't have any enemies to fear. None at all. He demonstrates his power over sin and death because They need to know what kind of God they serve. When they go out to spread the gospel, they need to know this. That is a powerful truth for us to digest. God has purposes. He delays because his purposes are just not fathomable to us. They're just too large. But in hindsight, we can often see that God had a real purpose behind what he was doing. Let me give you one more here. God also delays for growth. For growth. I don't know if you've ever had instant applesauce or instant lemon pudding. You know, there's a such thing as applesauce or instant lemon pudding, but there's no such thing as instant apples or instant lemons. You can't shorten the growing season. And that's what he wants. He wants to not shorten the growing season of our lives. He wants our faith to build. And unfortunately, on a sin-cursed planet, sometimes that requires sorrow and hardship and difficulty. And sometimes that brings tears and jagged puzzle pieces. I haven't given you a lot of good news today, have I? If Christ came to you and said, I can either heal your son from sickness or I can deliver him from Satan. I can make him physically well or I can make him spiritually secure. I can give him a great life or I can give him eternal life. Which do you choose? I think we all know that the choice is obvious for us here today. The fact that Jesus waited for Lazarus to die and then raised him from the dead precipitated Jesus' death according to the Gospel of John. It wasn't until this event occurred that they said, that's it. That's enough. We've had it. We're killing this guy. It wasn't until this event occurred, and Jesus knew that this event would send him to the cross. And when he gets to the cross, guess what he does for Lazarus? He saves him from his sins. The death of Lazarus, although it is tragic and sad and brings grief to the family, it was necessary because Jesus wanted to deliver him from something greater. And I honestly believe a good God does that for everyone in this building today, even though we don't understand it. So I want to caution you because I've been so guilty of this myself. When I'm in tragedy or grief or suffering, I want God to flex his muscle. I want him to flex his muscle and use his power and his might to get me out of it. But I don't usually ask him for his wisdom. I don't usually ask God to flex his mind about the matter. And I think as Christians, we need to rethink this. We need to ask God to deliver us with muscle and might and power. But we also need to say, Lord, in your wisdom, in your mind, you know what's best for me. If you will not deliver me from this tragedy, then deliver me from my immaturity. You make me the kind of man that I'm supposed to be, or the kind of woman that you called me to be here on this earth. Isn't that what Jesus prayed for in the Garden of Gethsemane? He said, he begged God for his power. He said, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will. Flex your mind, God. Let your will be done, whatever it is. So what have we learned? Tragedy is inevitable, even for the friends of Jesus. Delay is probable, even for the friends of Jesus. So here's the third lesson we want to learn today. Grief is natural, even for the friends of Jesus. Grief is natural, even for the friends of Jesus. I kind of wondered what the household must have looked like at this time. This is my guess. Maybe you can relate. I'm sure in this household in Bethany, life came to a standstill. It was as if someone pushed the pause button on life. Can't you picture Martha, normally concerned about the details of running an efficient domestic operation, allowing the dishes to pile up in the sink? The beds are not made up. The clothes in the hamper have all heaped up. And there's Mary, who usually sits at the feet of Jesus, but now all she sees is his footprints going in the wrong direction. And for this one time in their life, this odd couple was on the same page. Sleepless nights, loss of appetite, mascara streaks, red and swollen eyes. And they both shared the same exact burning statement. In verse 21, verse 32, and verse 37, they said, Lord, if you would have been here, our brother would not have died. Grief is natural, even for the friends of Jesus. Grief does not mean that we lack faith. Grief does not mean that we are weak or that something is wrong with us. God made us to grieve. And in fact, grief is so natural and such an appropriate response of the events and the tragedies that occur in our lives that Jesus cries himself. In verse 35, look at this. We say it all the time. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. Have you ever thought about how pregnant that little two-word statement is, that Jesus wept? He wept even though he knew what? He knew that in 10 minutes he's gonna raise Lazarus from the dead. In 10 minutes he's gonna be hanging out with his old buddy again, and they're gonna be eating roasted leg of lamb together, and he still wept. Now I know that the Bible says that there's not gonna be any tears in heaven. I know that. We sing about it. But I believe God weeps with us. If we weep over an animal or a pet that dies or gets sick, then certainly God would do no less for his children. He is a father, and he loves us. He sees what's happening to us on this planet. And when we weep, I believe that God weeps with us. He not only sees and hears our griefs and understands our grief, but I believe he weeps with us. Verse 35. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved them." But some of them said, "Cannot he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there was a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. So Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He raises his friend whom he loved from the dead, which leaves us with our last lesson we want to learn this morning. So what have we learned today? All right, tragedy is inevitable, even for the friends of Jesus. Delay is probable, even for the friends of Jesus. Grief is natural, even for the friends of Jesus. But hope is possible only for the friends of Jesus. That's where we find victory in this story. Jesus he is there in our time of grief if he is our friend. This is where hope is found in the midst of our grief and suffering. It's found only in Jesus the Christ. I'd like to go back in history just one more time as we prepare to close here this morning. Abraham, for every sacrifice you're called to make, even if it's your own son, for every one of them, there'll be a ram caught in the thicket by the horns. For every giant you're summoned to fell, David, there'll be a heavenly sniper to guide the stone. For every lion you face, Daniel, there'll be an unseen lion tamer to calm the beast. For every fiery furnace you enter, Shadrach, there'll be a fourth man in there with you, dousing the flames. For every storm-tossed sea, Peter, there'll be a master of the tempest that's on deck to calm the storm if you just trust in him. For every cemetery groundskeeper who rolls your final tombstone and plays Lazarus, there'll be a Lord who says, "Take away the stone." For every undertaker who lays your lifeless body in a Bethany tomb, Lazarus, there'll be an upper taker who says, come out. For every embalmer who cocoons you in grave clothes, Lazarus, there'll be one who comes along who is the resurrection and the life, and he'll say, loose him and let him go. Those jagged puzzle pieces we talked about, tragedy, grief, suffering, we all share this problem. But hope is only available in this building this morning for those of us who know Jesus. That's where hope is found. That's where delay gains meaning, and that's where grief is comforted. It's comforted in Jesus Christ. In the same way that Lazarus was raised from the dead and he received new life after death, so too will those of us who know Jesus. If you're not a friend of Jesus this morning, and I beg you, I beg you, please do not leave this building without making Jesus your friend, without making that decision. You can be immersed in baptism today. You can have your sins forgiven and washed away. You can do so today. If you're a two-timer, if you're the type of person who comes to church twice a year for Christmas and Easter, I'm thankful to God that you're here. I'm glad that you're here. I thank God for you that you've taken the time to be here with us today. We're thankful that you're here. But I don't want to just see you twice a year. I want to see you every Sunday. Will you make a decision to recommit your life to Christ? Will you rededicate yourself, your commitment to Jesus to become his friend? This morning, if you have any need whatsoever, if you want to be a friend of Jesus, you can do so today. Again, if you have any need, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing?